so much for joining us for the last weekend of Science Gallery Bengaluru's exhibition season, Psyche. For those of you who are new here, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a new public institution for research-based engagement. Psyche is our 5th exhibition season and the 3rd one, which is completely online. Over the past 45 days, Psyche has been unraveling the complexities of the human mind. Today, we have with us Ali Hussaini to deliver a lecture titled, Can Machines Come Alive? Before I introduce Ali to you, I'd like to tell you a bit more about some of the programs coming up this weekend. Do join us on 13th for an event by artist Alistair Hopwood and psychologist Stephen Frenda called Perspectives on News Events, where they share their findings on a research experiment they carried out during the exhibition season. Also join us for a very exciting walkthrough of a series of labs and clinics in a program titled Disease to Dish. It's a closer look at a research program that studies brain disorders using stem cells. This is led by a team at NIMHANS and NCBS. And this is on the 15th of May at 2 p.m. IST. Now to introduce our speaker for this evening. Ali Hussaini works at the cutting edge of art, technology, and science. His artwork, Ouroboros, was acclaimed by the New York Times, which calls him a biochemist, turned philosopher, turned television producer, turned visual poet. He is the co-director of National Gallery X, one of the founding partners of UKRI, Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub. And in 2020, he hosted 2 conferences on trustworthy AI. He recently contemplated possible futures of AI in 3 creative productions. The first, Groupthink, and the AI Gallery. In a special issue of the RUSI journal, 4 biologists responded to his essay, Modeling the Threat from AI, Putting Agency on the Agenda. I'd also like to remind the audience that there will be an interactive Q&A session, so do add your questions as they come to you in the Q&A box. We will also share a link to a feedback form in the chat box, so do share your thoughts about today's program as well as the exhibition with us. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ali for today's evening's lecture. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Metaphysics, and thank you to you and the Science Gallery for inviting me, and also to the audience for coming. So my topic today is called, Can Machines Come Alive? And I think this is a question which has been coming at us from popular media and as well as engineering realities now for several years. In other words, will artificial intelligence reach the point where it either becomes humanity's equal or superior? That's really what's at issue there. And I'm going to try to answer that question, or at least find what the framework for an answer is, by looking at biology and some of the philosophic issues involved. So right now I'll just share my screen and start a presentation. And let's see, I think I need to go back up to the introduction here, and let me just go full screen. So I became interested in the question of machine systems, machinic phylum, as it were, of life, when I was studying the origins of photography. And I was looking at photography as it emerged from ancient engineering. Photography we think of as a very singular machine, but actually it's a way of seeing, and it's a technical way of seeing, which has its origins in early forms of geometry and land surveying and cartographic representation. So as I looked at these origins, going back all the way to the beginning of civilization, say Mesopotamia in the West, and Harappa and India and Central America, you'd find it in the Mesoamerican cultures. They all developed geometry. And the question is geometry a form of technical perception? And is that an evolutionary process where we're getting essentially an assemblage of a new kind of organism that is that has constituents from more primordial organisms, in other words, us and our machines? So I was just trying to understand how cameras came to be, and I stumbled on a much bigger question, which I've puzzled over now for quite a few years. So one way of looking at this is, could industrial production be evolving into industrial reproduction. And I think that's a key issue, because right now we have machines as tools and we produce them. If these tools start to reproduce themselves, that might be a different, I'd venture to say, more dangerous situation. So even now we can look at the economies and how economies always have to grow, and why is it that economies have to grow even to the detriment of the environment and ultimately humanity? Is there another process there, another form of causality that we're just not identifying, or is it simply a matter of the system being out of control and out of balance? I think that's a really critical distinction. So when we think about production, that's about technical processes where you come up with a conception and you move into making a tool or a project or a product. Reproduction is what we see in everything from bacteria and viruses all the way up to humans. In other words, we have an impulse to reproduce ourselves and produce more like units. So right now, cars have to be manufactured. They don't somehow manufacture themselves and reproduce new and ever better models. It's a product of design. So that gets us to this question of, well, can machines come alive? You'll notice I'm taking the starting point is biology, and the reason is because the only kind of living creature we know is, or a creature that reproduces, is produced by biological evolution. And the question around artificial intelligence or autonomous systems has always been, well, these machines are going to get super intelligent, and then they're going to run around and dominate us. But in fact, we know that intelligence, intuitively, I think we know that intelligence is not, doesn't necessarily lead to dominance. In fact, if you think about all these sort of half-witted dictators who have very bright scientists working for them, that there's a social proof right there. So what we really need to fear, I think, are things that have a will to power or will to reproduce. And as we've seen in the past few years, a pretty dumb virus, through its imperative to reproduce, can be at least as deadly, and right now still more deadly than any of the machines that we've created. So this takes us to the problem of life. So I just call it philosophy 101, just in general, just to say, well, that's actually the fundamental problem of philosophy, which is, what is life? And that's related to the issue of consciousness, which is then related to the issue of what's the difference between living and non-living systems. In other words, the difference between humans and machines and our tools. And I think to understand whether machines can come alive, we have to very clearly distinguish between things that are automated and things that are tools and technical systems and biological, or at least self-reproducing systems. So right now, traditionally, we have a sort of great chain of being that starts with atoms and molecules and moves up through different forms of organization. And right in the middle, you see viruses, and I would call them a liminal form of organization that really signifies or marks the hazy transition between machines and organisms, or between mechanisms and organisms. So clearly there's machines below the viruses, there's bacteria above them. Viruses, well, they don't really live, but they hijack the machinery of living things. So, and then I think anything above the bacteria are clearly alive, all the way up to humans and possibly angels or some sort of spiritual beings. So we tend to think of the ascendance of life in terms of sentience and consciousness or intelligence, but there's another way of looking at it, which is simply in terms of its organization and its capacity to reproduce. And this scale captures both. But one distinction that we've made, and this is something I want to bear on now, is between matter and spirit. And if we look up here, we'd say at some point, as these things become fainter and more gray, they're getting more spiritual or more ethereal. And during the course of this lecture, I'm going to question whether that's really the case. But these are the qualities that we associate with matter and spirit. Matter is inert, spirit is alive. Another way of putting that is animate or inanimate, but anima at least in Latin, it means the soul. So it was always thought that the spirit is what makes things move. This is also the distinction between mechanism and organism. So, and finally, when we get into philosophic thought, it's metaphysics and physics. So we have metaphysics dealing with the spirit, and matter dealing with the body. Now, that's led to some problems when we're trying to define life. And we see this in Western philosophy over the last 400 years. And I'll apologize, I'm mainly referencing Western philosophy here. I realize I'm speaking in a non-Western context, so please, I'll honor that tradition, but I'm most familiar with the Western one, and please translate into terms that make sense in whatever philosophic tradition you are in. I have studied Indian and Eastern philosophy, but I'm not expert enough to integrate it into my talks. So in Western philosophy, we have one school of thought called idealism, where we say everything is spirit, and life manifests itself as possibly a cosmic consciousness. So everything is subsumed to spirit in this way of thinking. Now, what happened in the opposite way, and there are ancient Greek traditions of materialism, they weren't very popular. They became very popular after Descartes and after the 1600s, as science and mathematical models began to show their success and really start to explain more and more, at least physical phenomena. So we'd say life is an expression of physical forces. Now, there are problems with this, where we have matter dominating everything, not the least of which is that matter doesn't, or materialist explanations don't explain everything. So we can say, well, if we look at a spiritual explanation, it's hard to detect spirit, although there are traditions where, I suppose through meditation or prayer, one can examine spirit or observe it phenomenologically, but yet it's still hard to measure and to put into science, let alone engineering terms. On the other hand, we have very successful material engineering and material sciences, which predict quite a bit of few phenomena and let us manipulate the universe. So they're successful, but they don't really explain the fact of consciousness, let alone life at this point. So the animate and the inanimate still have a schism between the two, and that's where we come up with dualism, where we say, well, the universe is actually a hybrid of things, and maybe life happens when spirit somehow inhabits matter. I'm not going to argue for that, but the way I'd illustrate it is that life comes up right in between these two, and that is something we've lived with for a long time. But there are, particularly in Western society and scientific society, there's a strong imperative to put everything in material terms. Life remains a gray area between the two. So I'd like to look at the origin of some of these errors now in Western philosophy, specifically the thought of Descartes and other early modern thinkers. When they saw just how successful things were, mathematics could explain falling bodies and the arc of something if you throw it in the air, or ballistics for that matter, we began to look at things in informational terms. So we were able to measure the temperature of phenomena and measure, look at pressure and volume and judge the temperature from that, and form engines and actually refine engines from the steam engine to internal combustion onto nuclear physics. So materialism about 400 years ago began to evolve into reductionism. And that's really the philosophic school that I was explaining before when we said radical materialism. And dualism began to decline, particularly after Rene Descartes tried to reconcile physics and metaphysics. He said that, well, actually, just about every living creature is actually a mechanism, except for humans. And humans have an interface with the soul called rested in the pineal gland, and that's where consciousness came from. So what we found is that this whole rich spirituality, which, in actually non-Western traditions still, and in pre-modern Western thought, you had the spirit suffusing everything, infusing even things like rocks or stars and the wind, that became desiccated or dried up, and they began to eject the spirit from just about everything except the human skull. So Descartes' dilemma is one that we still have, actually, which is that materialism is unsavory. In other words, it doesn't really, we don't want to reduce ourselves to a mechanism. There was a thinker called De la Mettrie in the late 18th century, a French thinker, and he wrote a book called Man, or Humanity, Man, a Machine. We don't want to think of ourselves as machines. But metaphysics is untenable. In other words, metaphysics and the notion of spirit and spirit suffusing things or explaining everything is difficult to accept rationally, or at least in terms that Western rationality has. I think in actually the thoughts coming out of Hinduism or the metaphysics of Hinduism, there's a different approach to reconciling that, which I won't cover now, but which may well be on many people's minds. And I would be happy to discuss that after this talk. So Descartes' solution, which is where he said that everything but humans is a mechanism. In fact, the human body is kind of a machine, but there's a soul that has kind of a material interface, a user interface between your individual soul and your individual body. And this put dualism on the retreat. And I think it made explanations of philosophies or sciences anyway that took the spirit into account on the run. So around the mid 17th century, 1650 in Western years, they were thinking, well, the universe is a mechanism. We have the clockwork universe, the clock, being one of the most successful technologies of the time. And I think we see that we have a habit of projecting our most successful technologies onto everything we see. So if a clock is very advanced and produces this kind of animation, then the universe must be a clock. And in fact, our bodies must operate like a clock as well. So since Descartes, this dualism has lost ground because they never could detect the soul. People tried to weigh it, in other words, weigh a body before and after death to see if the soul has left it, if it has any weight. I think that movement has come and gone. And rational thought has been the privileged source of order. And that rational thought has found its sole expression in this mechanistic thinking, which we now associate with information and computer science. And I am going to criticize that, although not from the standpoint of traditions. So let's look at this reign of information that we have now. We're asking if machines can come alive, and to get more specific about that, there's a movement of writers or scientists, philosophers, thinkers, and they're called singularity theorists. And they say that machines will come alive, and that point is the singularity. And it's simply the time when machines become as intelligent or more intelligent with humans. And so what these thinkers are doing, and I'm going to identify this, why this is a fallacy, I'll state that it's a fallacy now, is they're saying that rational thought, which we can see can be embedded in machines, is purely mechanistic. And in fact, the impulse for rationality comes from mechanism. And it's that impulse, in other words, that will to live or will to power or will to do something, that it makes the critical difference, I think, between living and mechanical things. So here we are, the definition of singularity. I've just given that to you, but it's one way of looking at it as well. Machines will start designing new machines, and then they're going to outpace our capacity for rational thought. And then it just follows, and I'm not, actually, I don't think they give good reasons why these machines would then dominate humanity, because they're so much more clever. Whereas we've already established that actually someone who's pretty dim-witted or not, let's just not say not the most intelligent person, but really wants to be powerful, can dominate scientists and nations and bend them to their will. So I don't think rationality or the capacity for clever thinking is enough of a reason to say that this will lead to domination. So now, why is this conceivable philosophically? It's because we still think that organisms arise from mechanical causes. So going back to that great chain of being, which we looked at, we saw that, actually, I'll just jump back to it, even though it's coming up again. But we see that things towards the bottom of this, the atoms, molecules, rocks, well, they're fairly unorganized, although they do show some exquisite forms of organization as well, then at a microscopic level, or quantum level. And then flames and hurricanes, well, they're self-organizing and they're large scale. So is it given that the same principles of organization that produce quantum effects or molecules, or for that matter, hurricanes, giving the force behind life? Now, clearly they're related because we all are living in the material world, or we all persist in the material world. But the real fallacy arises because we privilege rational thought as a special motive. So let's look at where and how some of these other motives might arise. I would say that one way of looking at it is matter plus complexity equals an organism. But is that really enough? We need to look at where the source of animation, the anima, the spirit. Remember, we were talking about anima being spirit or soul, and also being the source of movement. So in that way of thinking, well, there's the physical self of me that you see right here, my visage on the screen. Somewhere, maybe floating around in my brain or in my heart, is some sort of spiritual being, and it's a puppet master pulling this. So all we need is matter and enough complexity, we get an organism. And now in this great chain of being, we replaced angels with computers. So we think that, well, with enough complexity, if the computers are more complex than humans, they're going to supersede us. So they take the place of angels. And I think if you really look at the literature around the singularity, Ray Kurzweil is one of the people who wrote it. He even wrote a book, Spiritual Machines, and they've taken the place of angels. And I think that there's a cultural phenomenon here which is quite telling. It's not a full argument against this, but we see that we tend to project what is best or most superior in humans to some higher entity. It used to be angels, gods, or spirits. Now it's computers. So let's look at that social phenomenon and look at technology as a metaphor. I alluded to this earlier, and I think we always use our successful technologies, or at least in the West, and I can't speak to non-Western traditions, as universal explanations. So let me give you a few examples. In ancient Greece, over 2,000 years ago, they were quite advanced, not necessarily in every form of mechanism, but in terms of painting and sculpture, and they really tried to make them realistic. So there was a painter named Zeuxis who, said it made a painting of grapes so real that a bird tried to eat them. And then there was a sculptor named Daedalus who made the wings of Icarus. And Socrates, in one of Plato's dialogues, says, well, Daedalus's sculptures were so realistic that they had to be tied down. In other words, by simply making something realistic enough, it's going to come alive. And I think we see this same psychological tendency in the explanations now about computers superseding or replacing humanity. And I've given another example that's intermediate, which is the clock. In Europe, clocks were pretty sophisticated mechanisms by the 1700s, and I think the Europeans traded them around the world. And the Europeans conceived of these clocks. Well, they said, well, if things are moving, they must have some sort of clockwork mechanism. So you've probably seen beautiful images of the clockwork universe, of the cosmos as a clock. And the same idea applied to the human self. In other words, maybe we're just wound up at some point, and we're just playing out a kind of program as a clock would do. But these metaphors have ultimately fallen short. We know that if you make something a realistic sculpture, it's not going to come alive, and nor do we or the universe run like clocks. So now I would argue that we're saying, or I do argue, that we're doing the same thing with computers and information, because information technologies have been so successful at modeling quite a few human activities now. They can drive, They're starting to perform mathematical proof. They can play chess. They're starting to perform mathematical proofs. We're leaning on autonomous systems for more and more tasks that were once thought uniquely human, including making art. Maybe the art isn't so good, and maybe the driving isn't so good either. But we think they're going to get better. Does this really make them alive, though? I was looking. This is a history of all these different technologies, words creating the world. Actually, words were quite evocative. Then everything being number, and then the sculpture and the clockwork. This just reiterates that conclusion that I gave, which is, now it's clear that life is a computational algorithm. And without going into the arguments for it yet, I'm going to in a moment. I'd say we can see that there's a psychological origin to this fallacy, which is in the tradition that I'm speaking from, always taking our latest technology and greatest technology and saying that life, the universe, and everything derives from something like that. So in this way of thinking, it's information that gives rise to order. So we've gotten rid of the spirit here. We don't need the spirit. This is the ultimate in reductionism. Everything animate comes out of information. And we see this actually, and they repeat it without even really knowing we're repeating it when we look at, say, the use of genetics as an explanation for everything. And gene is a template, and but yet we tend to, sort of like a blueprint, yet we think of genes being the cause of life. And we see this in popular culture where, I just saw a film where somebody said, oh, they just seeded the oceans with DNA and life came about. And to me, that was like saying, well, we just took a bunch of blueprints and dropped them on the ground and buildings arose. If you think about it, they're both pretty fallacious notions. But unfortunately, this also fuels a lot of current science and biomedical research, where we're looking at genetic causes of illness and also the relationship to wellness, without looking at the broader spectrum of possible causes, and in fact the actual origins of the biological order and the life order. In other words, I'll argue it's not just information. So this discovery of genes coincided with the success of codes in computers. And so this is really where how we're thinking now is, well, we program the computer, and there's an activity, and genes program an organism, and there's activity. And the way of looking at this is hardware and software. The software being the program, the computer, the physical computer being the hardware, and then you have this kind of motion. We think the same thing with our bodies. These genes are just causing the activity, and that actually ignores a great deal of evidence, which you don't even need to be a scientist to observe and argue from. But as we see here, that now the program and the genes have replaced the soul as the source of animation in the body. So bodies are hardware, genes are software. And so we can look at the evolution of dualism here, starting with matter and spirit. Things are more or less matter in traditional ways of thought, and then that congealed or hardened into body and soul. And then we got the thing and the word. So we start to really, at this point, this is, well, if you look at particularly Western biblical traditions where the word has creative force, but this is infused philosophy with this notion that the word or that information is something that's separate from the thing that it speaks of. You may be familiar with semiology or semiotics, where you have mind and signs, and linguistics takes this as a given. And finally, there's the association of mechanism and rationality, machine and code, and hardware and software. So these are just metaphors, though, if we look at that, because they don't necessarily stand for real relationships among things in the world. They're assumptions that we take because of our particular philosophic perspective. So I'm saying here that since Descartes, the philosophic dualism, may may have lost credibility. In other words, very few Western thinkers would argue that there's a soul, but it continues by other means. And now with dualism in the current era, they're saying there's this genetic software which has taken the place of the soul, informing, literally informing, forming in the hardware of the body. So now let's look at information and organization. I'm going to introduce a concept of organization, which is going to counter this idea or complement it. We don't want to throw out information, but it needs to be mediated with certain things. So I've talked about the psychology of projecting our latest accomplishment onto the world and tending to identify, reduce everything to a simple explanation that identifies with whatever our latest science or technology is. And first, I'll argue that resemblance is not identity, and we've moved now often towards using computer simulations, but they're simulations, even if they produce accurate results, are not reality. And finally, metaphors are not explanations. So when we are explaining something, we need to examine our assumptions for that explanation and see whether there's a cognitive or psychological bias or a historical bias that's producing that explanation, rather than a grounding in observation and measurement and some sort of theory that grounds both into a broader system of rationality. Because usually with most of these metaphors, they're ignoring a lot of evidence. And with genetics, I don't have time to go through that, but genetic theory, as I presented it here anyway, or the neo-Darwinianism, modern synthesis, it's also called. Sorry, I need some word. So neo-Darwinian theory ignores a lot of evidence. And let's look at some of this evidence now, after looking at the evolution of high-tech word, numbers, sculpture, clocks, computers. But there's a fallacy, which is that computation happens in any medium, and that computation is general while organisms are unique. And this only holds for certain kinds of physical systems. In other words, non-living physical systems. So, and in fact, programs can be executed in logic gates, but here's where we start to peel this off, is that genes function only in cells. So you can't just seed an ocean with DNA and expect life to happen. In fact, DNA doesn't do anything on its own. It's inert. It's a good storage medium, but you need to insert, or DNA needs to be in the context of a cell to have meaning. And it certainly doesn't animate that cell. What it does is it gives it serves as a kind of memory there. So there's some biological fallacies that are forming this. And here's just some trends that I'll tell you about, which is that the concept of gene is slipping. We now, if you're interested, look up epigenetics and look at how there are other compounds within the cell and other systems within the cell which actually control gene expression. These are called epigenetic factors. And depending on the configuration of epigenetic factors, what we call a single gene, which is just a stretch of DNA in a chromosome, is unraveled, and it can produce numerous proteins from the same stretch. So there's not a single gene, or the single gene doesn't correlate to a single gene genetic expression. So right there, we start to, you can see that there are problems with defining a gene, because there's not a one-to-one correlation between the gene and the activities around it. And then sometimes just a subsection of that template is used, sometimes a broader section, sometimes it's switched on permanently, and that switch can be inherited. So not everything is inherited genetically, although most things are. So organisms are very material specific. They only happen in places with organic chemistry, and the only situation we know of is the life world on Earth, what some people call Gaia, but we're looking for it on other worlds, and we've seen alternative forms of life and living activity on the Earth, but we have yet to see it emerge in any other medium. So I've already said this about genes. So if we look at now, I'll start to wind down here. The problem with physics is that genes don't explain the thermodynamic qualities of life. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that I think everybody would agree, however skeptical you are of everything else I've said, that perpetual motion machines are impossible. Yeah, we have organisms self-propagating, and not just in the span of our individual life, but for 4 billion years. In other words, since life started, not long after the Earth congealed out of molten stellar dust, we have this self-propagating system called life. So let's look at systems theory, and I urge anybody to look at systems theory, which was founded by a thinker named Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and I'd be happy to give the reference in the chat or in questions later. But in systems theory, the organization is the analytic unit. In other words, instead of bits or pieces of information or units of meaning, syntactic units, or phonemes, or however you want to slice and dice information, it's the organization and a certain level of organization, which is the analytic unit. And we would argue with biology that it's the cell or the organism itself that is the unit of analysis, and that's where the theory needs to start. So organizations can be nested. In other words, we have organizations within organizations, and the way to think about this is your body's made of many cells. Each cell has the potential to be autonomous, but it's nested within your body and serves that greater whole. So there's a downward causation as well as linear causality. And it's that downward causation which has been eliminated from Western thought. We call it teleological causation or organizational causation. That's the key to understanding this. So in linear causality, which informs this information-based system, you have design mediating the unit, whatever that unit is, a bit, a byte, a girder, a brick, and that design is building that organization, so that in that way of thinking, we can design a brain, and then that brain will function as a brain. In circular causality, you have evolution, and you have pressures, and evolution means there are pressures between the unit and the system of organization where that unit persists. And I won't argue, I'll simply state that the only way we know brains or brain-like activities arising are through circular causality and through the evolutionary process of life. And that is something which you can simply examine. Probably, I think anybody would have gone to the point where they learned that already, which is that life is an evolutionary process. The nature of that process is still being elucidated, but we've never designed a living thing, and there's never been a brain design. So that idea that the brains can be designed, or that computers can be designed, or that the self-designing computers will somehow come alive is quite speculative. That's not enough to say it's untrue, but it is speculative. So just to illustrate this, in linear causality, you have like this assembly line where you have input, algorithm, output, and I call that the dualist ghost. There's still a bit of dualism there. In circular causality, you have an integration where things self-assemble via energy inputs. So this illustration shows how energy is shared among all these different inputs in the system, and as long as energy is coming into the system, say through the sun, you have life occurring. So this is why machines run down and organisms keep living. Machines run down because they run out of fuel, and organisms keep living because they have a metabolism. So, and that's where the second law of thermodynamics comes in. The second law states that, well, when you have energy, that energy is available for work, and the energy is dissipated, and there's no more work available. And the way to think about that is putting fuel in the tank of a car or charging the battery of a car. When that energy is gone, you need to seek another source. The car doesn't seek it out itself. Whereas as living beings in the life organization, things automatically go and eat, and part of the environment captures energy from other parts of the environment and makes it available as energy to other living creatures. So you have this metabolic interplay. So life itself is a grand system. It's not this singular unit, and we don't exist outside of this system. So when we try to project the qualities of life onto machines, we're evading the way that life evolved and the way that life persists, and in fact breaking a law of physics. So we would say that theoretically the way we think of this is that life occurs under a set of organizational constraints, and that constraint is energy. So we see the energy there. So life takes energy from its ecosystem, it's circular, and machines are linear. And if you just contemplate these two diagrams here, I think that makes the point. And I think I'll probably wrap now. Let me have some more slides here, but there's this notion, I'm criticizing the notion that matter and complexity, that does make a machine, but it's matter plus organization that makes an organism. So there's a fundamental distinction where we have duality, but not dualism. There's a lot of concepts here. I think I'm just going to leave you though with this idea that life takes its energy from the ecosystem. We call that autocatalytic systems, and the system below is a catalytic system. So let's take this over to questions. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and thank you very much for listening to me. I hope some of this was useful for you.
Thank you, Ali, for that really interesting talk. And I'm just going to encourage all the members of the audience that if you have any questions, please do share them in the Q&A box. We'll share them with Ali, and Ali will be happy to answer those live. So just type them in the Q&A box. So I'm going to maybe start off with a question while we wait for the audience to share their thoughts. So it was a fascinating talk, a lot going on, and a lot to sort of wrap one's head around in terms of, understanding, I guess, fundamentally, what is it we define as being alive as a starting point, and then looking at machines. So let me maybe address a sort of elephant in the room in that. So do you think therefore it's inevitable that machines would achieve what we consider as aliveness at some point? What's your what is your take on
My
it?
take is, I don't think that we're going to design machines that come alive, and because if we do, we should regulate that. So I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's possible. What I am more concerned about are evolutionary forces happening in what we might call the technosphere. If we think about the biosphere, then we have this technosphere that we layered on top of it, and the technosphere is actually coming to dominate our environment. And the question I really have, and I don't have an answer for this, is are these evolutionary forces starting to take hold in the technosphere? And that's when I started with that question, which I still think has to be I don't know that we answer it, but we need to start asking it and researching it. Is that when does the system of industrial production become a system of industrial reproduction? So it has to make that transition point. And the thing is, there are some really clear lines, actually, scientifically, that we can draw between a mechanical system and an organic system or a quasi-organic system. And one of those is how it uses energy. So in physics terms, that would be looking at this, how does it actually honor the second law of thermodynamics? Does it run down, or does it somehow keep running? So if you think about a machine or an artificial system that ran around and unfurled its solar panels and refueled its battery periodically, that starts to become something that acts more like something that's alive, especially if it takes increasingly strong measures to find its place in the sun. And then if it tries to replace the batteries and make more versions of itself, then we start to move into dangerous ground. I don't think it's inevitable, but what I will say is I don't think the danger is going to come from smart systems. It's going to come from reproductive systems, from the virus just wants to reproduce. It doesn't have any intellect, but it has it has agency. And so actually it's giving agency to these systems, and real agency where they take on and form their own agenda, that I think is dangerous.
So it's very interesting. So I think essentially what, especially something that I personally may have always somehow thought is that consciousness and conscious thought somehow is very much connected to the sense of aliveness, or to an organism being intelligent, right? And now the way you describe it, it almost takes a backseat, right? Like it's the need to survive and the ability to continue surviving, which when you especially when you gave that example of the virus, right, it makes so much sense almost in that context. So no, I think that's really interesting. And I guess a follow-up sort of question that comes to my mind is also that the fact is that we are almost considering like the technosphere as a separate entity, like you said, on top of the biosphere. But like a lot of what we've seen is how technology and machinery, like for instance, is becoming part of organic systems. So organic systems are now coming in, are getting integrated with technology, right? And what does that then mean, right? Like, is it that we are changing our systems, or are we now considering that those systems are becoming part of something that is alive?
Well, Madhushri, those are both really, really astute comments. First, I think looking at agency and that survival, I think you summarized that very well. And I think the question that you just asked about, well, what's happening is technology, is the biosphere becoming the technosphere? Or, we start to see bacteria now that eat plastic. And for instance, that and we're starting to find that now that actually quite a few life forms are now dependent on the big plastic islands out in the middle of the Pacific. So that is an open question. If you read James Lovelock, he came up with the Gaia thesis or Gaia hypothesis. And if you actually, he saw this as just another phase of evolution. And he makes that very explicit in his last book, Novacene. Novacene. He thinks that actually, this is just a phase comparable to what was called the Great Oxygenation Event, which happened, some 3 billion years ago, when these life forms made a lot of oxygen, and in fact, the oxygen was toxic, and virtually everything died off. But then new life forms arose that could live in that toxic, highly oxygenated environment that we live in. Oxygen enabled them to use considerably more energy, so they became more complex, and eventually, produced human beings and all the other miraculously clever creatures that co-inhabit the earth. So it could be that we're just a phase. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is if that in fact is a phase, it's not likely to include humanity in the next step. Because this environment, if it's akin, well, it seems like the environment is becoming more hostile towards at least having several billion people on the planet, and it is becoming more toxic. So maybe these other organisms, Lovelock was quite explicit about this, and at his age of 96 or so when he wrote it, he was very sad about watching the demise of humanity in his earlier introductions to the book in the 70s. But by this decade, he said, well, it's just, it's not evil. This is just evolution. So that's an open question, Madhushri. I think, is it evolution or not? But I think we need to be asking it and use that to frame our research and our philosophic inquiries around that research.
Yeah. So given that this like, as a philosopher, you've sort of spoken about this in depth, but you also work in a very interdisciplinary way, right? And so what, when I'm sure you've been working with technologists and other people. So what has been sort of the key challenges or critiques, or that have come up when others have sort of brought their perspectives to this? Like what has been the debate around this?
Well, it's still a very vibrant debate. I mean, I think that many, actually, we have. Sorry, I can hold that, but there's a
Follow-up.
question from the audience too. So, Manjushri, should I answer your question, or
No, I think
I'll ask that. There's a vibrant debate. I think people are really intrigued by looking at the question of agency as opposed to intelligence. So there's very much something in the air right now, where I think it's because we're delegating so much autonomy to machines now that we have to think in terms of agency, and agency there's some narrow definitions of it where it's quite important. For instance, in terms of legal responsibility, we think of agency. So when somebody commits a grievous error that results in a death, for instance, the court tries to establish agency. Now, the self-driving car, and we've heard all kinds of moral dilemmas with that. Makes that philosophic question and one that is actually both has great social import and social and political impact, but also legal and financial impact. So establishing agency and defining it and redefining it for an age when agency is now distributed far. I mean, they always say guns don't kill people, don't kill people, people do, or something like that. You'd have to pull a trigger on a gun. But now if there's a self-guiding missile that has just been put up with no target, but just has some criteria for targeting, in military, or cars driving around, usually you'd say, okay, it's a mistake or it's malicious, or was it in between being a mistake, which is forgivable, and malicious, which is not? Was somebody drunk? In other words, there's enough agency there. They weren't being responsible. So applying that to machines is not so easy. So I think it's a very rich field right now, and there's been interest in the arts. Yesterday, we had the first installment of what we call the Art and AI Salon at National Gallery X, which I co-direct, and we'll be releasing that as a podcast, so you'll get to hear some of those debates too.
No, that would be fascinating. Why don't we take, there are a couple of questions, there are two questions from the audience. So the first question is from Samyukta, and her question was a follow-up from the question on the technosphere and the biosphere becoming more closely integrated. And she asks, is there a potential for the need to self-propagate to transfer from the biosphere to the technosphere?
I think that the answer to that question is that there is a potential for the self-propagation from the biosphere to the technosphere. And that, I think, is where it's really dangerous. I've noticed that there are some experiments with machine learning where they actually embody the machines in these little robots. And if they're imperfect, they actually learn more quickly and more accurately. And that's an evolutionary behavior. So there are certain behaviors that could transfer. Some of my colleagues in biology would argue that you absolutely, living behavior is absolutely embedded in carbon-based systems and have a certain form, and it is quite complex what produces the life forms that we see. But I would argue that we need to leave the question open, because if you have enough moving parts in it and enough complexity and enough energy sources and resources, maybe there are behavioral conditions that can arise that would mimic the behavior or extend. Let's just say they would themselves evolve into systems. But very open question, and one that I think needs vibrant debate, and there's no resolution to it. I'm not sure if my answer is correct. We need to research that.
The next question is from Mark, and he asks, does competition inevitably outweigh cooperation in human linear abstractions, from language to national identities and catalytic technology, objectifying nature and outgroup people? Or how can we rebalance cooperation of humans, groups, nations, and technologies with nature?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I probably don't have an answer to it. I don't think that the philosophy or the scientific principles that I'm presenting would provide a good answer to that. But I think that clearly in general, I think we have the capacity for cooperation as well as competition, and at least on my brighter days, I think that our cooperative tendencies are stronger than our competitive tendencies. And it could be that each emerges in the context where they're most needed. So these traits are adaptive traits, and there are situations where competition works better, and for the survival of a group or an organizational unit, and other situations where cooperation serves the purpose. I think that I really hope and feel that this is a choice that we can make, however. So I don't think that I mean, it could be that there are principles, whether scientific, philosophical, psychological, neurological, that determine this, but I do think those two possibilities fall within the realm of human freedom. And that said, I would argue for cooperation, except where competition is healthy and regulated.
Thank you, Ali, for that answer. If there are any other questions, please do share them now, or else we could. I'd also like to tell everyone that there is a tutorial with Ali in half an hour. So if you have more questions and are 15 to 28 years old, do join us for the tutorial with Ali. So the team would share the link with you. And maybe we can take, Ali, I'd like to thank you for this lecture. It was really very interesting. And I think it's given us a lot to think about, especially, I will be rethinking how I approach the idea of aliveness for a start. I think that's been one of the biggest points that I've sort of picked up from this lecture. And I'm really glad that, I was able to attend this and have this discussion with you. And I'd also like to tell all our audience members that if you want to re-listen to this talk, to kind of go back and absorb some of it again, the recording will be up on our YouTube channel, so you can always watch it again. And if you missed out any of our previous events, similarly, they're all there on our YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed this lecture, you can also check out a talk by historian Arthur Miller on machine psyche / human psyche, where he again picks up some of the interesting points brought out by Ali in his talk. And you can also check out the exhibit titled Synthetic Self by Stella, a performance artist who explores the mind-body problem as well. I'd also like to remind the audience to fill in the feedback form and share your thoughts on the program, and visit the exhibition website, which will be coming to a close this weekend. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you in the tutorial session later tonight and for the rest of the programs until Sunday. Thank you again, Ali, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Abhishri. Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming.